All right, how many of you have seen the movie Inside Out? It's such a good movie. I saw the first one I saw in the movie theater, and there's a scene in it that I won't tell you what it is because it's not pertinent to the story, but it is. There's one scene that's so sad. I was ugly crying, not just like sobbing, face snot crying, but it's so good. It's so good. I show it to my kids. It is a great movie to talk about emotions with kids, because the premise of both movies is that there's this little girl, Riley. Here's Riley on the left. Riley is, a little girl. She's going through the things she's going through. But what they show us is they personify her emotions. And then they show us, and here's from the first movie, the emotions. In the first movie, I think she's 11. And so her emotions are anger and disgust and joy and fear and sadness. And so each of those little characters is one of the emotions. And the one leading the charge is joy. So Riley is by and large a joyful, happy child, because that console, you see, that's Riley's brain. Okay, we're looking in her brain, and that's her control center. So when joy is in charge, joy makes it so that good things are happening and Riley's reacting well. Okay, so that's the premise of the movie. Well, the second movie came out this summer, and it's also very good. It's so good. I need to buy it because I want to watch it again. There's some scenes in it that I was like at one point she says something, Joy gets locked away, and she's like, is this what it means to grow up, that she never feels joy again? And I'm like, but it's so good. But when Riley, in this movie, Riley turns 13. And as any of you who've been around a 13-year-old know, that the emotions get a lot more complex. And when Riley turns 13, the control panel gets wiped out and this really complicated one gets replaced. And all these new characters show up. All these new emotions show up. And the emotion I want to talk about today is anxiety. That's the little orange creature. That's anxiety. And anxiety shows up on the scene. And what happens is she's heading into, I guess, middle school, and they're going to a different school. And she and her best friend, she moved in the first movie, she made some best friends, and they're these goofy girls who just like to be fun. They just to be goofy, and they listen to music, and they play hockey, and they do all the fun things that 13-year-olds do. Well, they're on their way to camp. They're on their way to hockey camp, because they all play hockey. And they're so excited because the premier hockey coach is going to be there. The coach of the Firehawks is going to be there. And the girls are all excited because if they have a good showing at this camp, they might get invited to be on the Firehawks team. And this is like the coveted team, right? And their idol, this girl named Valentine, is going to be their Val. And they just think she is the coolest person ever, and they're all geeking out about how they're going to get to meet the Firehawks and meet the coach, and if they have a good tryout, and they're really excited. But just before they land at camp, her two best friends say, by the way, we got assigned to a different school next year. We won't be going to school with you anymore. And so Riley's about to step out of the car, and she's suddenly flooded with all these emotions, like, wait, what? My best friends aren't going to be there with me? I don't know how to handle this. And so she's having this emotional response, but she's getting out of the car. She's trying to look cool, and she's trying not to be sad. And then this anxiety comes in, and Riley meets Val, and she acts like a goofball, and she's like, oh my gosh, Val's going to think I'm a total nerd. And so she starts to really get all anxious and all stressed out because she realizes her friends aren't going to be there. And if her friends aren't at school with her next year, how is she going to have new friends? And so she decides for herself that the only way that she can possibly survive high school or the next school is if she's on the Firehawks team. Because her friends won't be there, and the only good possible outcome is if she's on the Firehawks team. And so she goes through this process. Anxiety takes over the control center. In fact, anxiety takes joy and all the other emotions and represses them and locks them away, and anxiety starts running the show. And so Riley starts misbehaving, basically. She gets so scared, she totally changes who she is. She ditches her old friends. She starts to act like whatever she thinks the Firehawks will think is cool, she's like, oh yeah, that's cool. And anything they make fun of, she's like, yeah, that's stupid. Even if it's something she loves. She totally reinvents herself to be something different. She can't sleep at night. And here's one of the reasons. There's a short little clip here. So there's an area in her imagination that comes up with scenarios or memories, right? And so anxiety gets all these little brain cells, these imagination cells. She's like, I need you guys to all come up with worst case scenarios. We need to think of all the worst case scenarios so that we can handle them. Because there's this lie that if we haven't already thought of a worst case scenario, we'll be unequipped to deal with it. And so Riley is so stressed out because all she can think of, all she can imagine is every worst case scenario. That she makes a fool of herself, that the Firehawks reject her, she doesn't make the team, she, never plays hockey again. All these worst case scenarios start playing in her brain, and it's all she can think of. She can't sleep, she can't eat, and she's like, okay, in order to make this so this doesn't happen, I have to make the Firehawk team. So she reinvents herself, she gets up early to practice, she ditches her friends, she pretends she's something she's not, she loses her mind. And at one point, towards the end of the movie, it just all comes like spiraling, and she has a panic attack in front of all the other kids. Can you imagine the shame that you would feel if you have a panic attack in front of your idol? But she can't help it. Anxiety has totally taken over and is spazzing out in the control panel. And Riley has this moment, she's just crying. And her friends come up, her true friends, recognize that she's in pain, and they come up and they help get her out of it. But you know what? This is fiction, but this is not unrealistic. And that's what I love about these movies. They help us to understand what's going on in our brains. Because I'm sure all of us have felt anxious at some point, even if we're not riddled with anxiety. I found this statistic, and I read it and I was like, really? But it's like the Anxiety and Depression Association of America. So I'm like, okay, I guess it's true. It says that 3% of adults have anxiety disorders. I was like, that seems really small. I thought it would be a higher number. 31% of kids have anxiety disorders. And I'm like, what? Like that, the kid one, I believe. I almost think that's, because I think about like my students. I have a lot of students who struggle with anxiety and depression and bipolar. But so that statistic, 30% of kids are struggling with anxiety and 3% of adults. And as I was trying to verify that fact, and there's all kinds of facts, and they're all like different subsets, so it's hard to compare. But one thing I did notice as I was looking is the older we get, the less we struggle with anxiety. The older population has a way smaller percentage of anxiety, and I thought that was interesting. And I wonder if it's because as we've gotten, I don't know if it's a generational thing, or if it's just as we get older, we learn to cope better. I don't know exactly why that is, but I thought that was an interesting statistic. But anxiety's been around forever. It's not that no one has had anxiety until recently. Cell phones have definitely compounded the anxiety situation, especially for kids. But anxiety's been around forever. We even see it in the Bible. There's a story in the Bible where Jesus is, we believe he is our Messiah, and so he, like the guy who saved us, and so he would travel around with, he had this like merry band of dudes that he traveled around with, and they would go from city to city, and when they would get to a city, they would just find someone to stay with, which I just think is so funny. Like, I can't imagine, like, I'm just going to go to Michigan and just find somebody who'll let me stay at their house. But that's what he did. He would just travel, and people knew who he was, because he was starting to gain some, like, renown. And so these two women, Mary and Martha, they're sisters. And they were, he came to their town, and they're like, come stay with us. So here's the story. It says this: Jesus and his disciples were on their way. He came to the village where a woman named Martha opened her home to him. And she had this sister called Mary, who sat at the Lord's feet, listening to what he said. But Martha was distracted by all the preparations that had to be made. She came to him and said, Lord, Don't you care that my sister has left me to do all the work? Tell her to help me. Martha, Martha, the Lord answered, you are so worried and upset about many things, but few things are needed, and indeed only one. For Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken from her. Can you imagine, Jesus is coming to your house for dinner? Can you imagine the anxiety of like, oh my gosh, I got to make the house clean and perfect, and I got to make the perfect meal, and all his friends are going to be there, and what, I would probably be just like Martha. I'm going to be honest. I would be so worried about getting my house clean and making the perfect meal. And she was feeling all this anxiety. She was thinking to herself, if Jesus isn't impressed by this, he might reject me. I think that's old. It doesn't say that in the text, but that's what I'm thinking she's actually thinking. I need to be impressive to the Lord so he doesn't reject me. Many of us are afraid of being rejected by others and by the Lord. And Jesus is like, Martha, stop it. He says, you're worried about many things. Martha's little control panel, her imagination was also coming up with all the worst case scenarios about what might possibly go wrong at this dinner. And she was like, ah! He's like, chill, baby. It's fine. Look at what your sister's doing. She's just sitting here at my feet, listening to me because she knows that's what's best. We get so up in our heads. I do it. For me, it's my to-do list. I get so like, I've got so much to do, and I get all worked up in my head. How am I ever going to get done? If I don't get it done, I'm a failure. And if I'm a failure, then I failed God, I failed my family, and that's where my mind goes. And so for me, my anxiety comes from my to-do list, much like Martha. But God's like, I don't care about all that. What I care about is that you come and sit at my feet. What I care about is that you want to hang out with me. Don't worry about all that stuff. Just come and be with me. Because we worship a God who's about relationship, not works. And this idea of being anxious, even Paul was a guy who followed Jesus after Jesus was gone. He was writing to his church in Philippi, and he says the same thing to them. He says, don't be anxious. Don't be anxious about anything, but in every situation and everything that comes up, by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests before God, and the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your heart and your mind. What he's saying is, instead of using your imagination to come up with all the worst case scenarios, come sit at my feet. Come talk to me about it. Pray about it. Give thanks for it. Come to me and tell me what's bothering you, and let me take care of it. Take all those worries you have and hand them over to the Lord. What we do is we hand them over to the Lord. Here you go, God. And then we sit here and go. And if he doesn't take care of it right away, we pull him right back. And we carry those burdens with us. But what God is saying, what Jesus is saying, or Paul is saying here, he's like, hand your burdens, hand your fears over to God, and then back up and let go. Did you know that faith and fear are two ends of the same continuum? So faith is over here, and fear is over here, and anxiety is a type of fear. So if you have an anxiety problem, you have a faith outage. The more you are anxious, the less faithful you are being in that moment. And so what's the antidote to that? It's just to lean into your faith, because faith conquers fear. Faith conquers fear. When you come to God and you say, here are my problems, and you back up and you don't take the problems with you, you are handing them to him and you're saying, I am trusting you, Lord, to do something about this. And the answer might not look like you think it should. He might solve it in a different way than you think. But he takes care of that. He is faithful to take care of those fears. He's saying, come to me, sit at my feet, trust me. When you are fearful and anxious, you're saying to God, I don't trust you. I don't believe that you're good. I don't believe you're going to take care of me. I think I got to take care of this all on my own. So I'm going to come up with all these scenarios, and I'm going to imagine every possible bad thing, and I'm going to prepare myself for all those bad things that could possibly happen. And he's saying, stop it. Sit at my feet. Give them to me. Trust me. Let me take care of this. Have faith in me. Move towards the faith end of that spectrum and away from the anxious part of that spectrum, right? So my topic was for kids, and I'm looking around the room, and not too many of us in this room have children, so I'm going to breeze through these because a lot of these are things you can do with your kids. But kids feel anxious, as that statistic showed. Kids feel anxious, and their faith is not yet fully developed because they're kids. Right? They don't have that faith. Their faith muscle isn't very strong yet. And if you are like in that moment, if your faith muscle is not very strong, if you are feeling the anxiety, I'm going to give you a couple other. This is number one. First and foremost, sit at Jesus' feet. First and foremost, give him your fears and trust him. But if that's failing you, if you need something in the short term while you're waiting, because let's be real, God sometimes takes way longer than we think. I can tell you that from experience. He takes way longer sometimes than you think. While you're waiting, here are some other tips, things you can do to help you not feel so anxious. Some of these tips come from this book called The Whole Brain Child, which looks at the effects of anxiety and the whole brain of the child. And they've come up with some practical tips, and then I added a couple too. So the first one is name it and tame it. I teach my kids this one. When you can understand the emotion you're feeling, then you can control it. And so kids especially, they don't have the vocabulary. They feel icky, they feel like, but they don't know what they're feeling. And so if we can give them a vocabulary for that, and I would say there are adults this way. I have a friend whose husband is this way. When he is scared, he acts angry because I don't think he understands what he's feeling, and so he just lashes out. One time his wife got hurt, and he was mad at her and screaming at her. And she's like, I can't even be hurt. And I'm like, as I think about it as an outsider, I'm like, yeah, it's because he didn't understand what he was feeling. He just knew it was icky. And so he was angry about it. So when we can identify the emotions, when we can put names on them, then we can say like, oh wait, I'm feeling frustrated. Okay, this will pass. Oh, I'm feeling scared. Oh, I'm feeling anxious. Oh, I'm feeling overwhelmed. And when you can name it, because for me, like on my schedule, I get, when I'm like, oh wait, I'm feeling anxious about my schedule, then I can come to God and be like, God, I'm feeling anxious about my schedule. Help me with it. But I have to identify that and be able to verbalize that. So coming up with a vocabulary for our emotions helps a lot. So teaching our kids to have a vocabulary for their emotions is super helpful. This one's for kids, is a bravery object. It could be a bracelet, it could be a temporary tattoo. So when they go to school and they're all like, they can look at their bracelet and maybe it says bravery or faith or something, and they're like, wait a minute, I have a God who helps me. Or wait a minute, I am brave. And they see that thing, and then they can remember, like, wait a minute, I'm brave. I am strong. I believe in God, and God is good. Something to remind them to be brave in that moment. This is one I always say to everybody in every situation is a memory verse. We should all have memory verses. So like for me, that do not be anxious, but in all things, prayer and petition, give your request to God. Look, that's not on the slide, and I know it. Because when I'm feeling anxious, I tell myself, do not feel anxious. But in every situation, like I have memorized that verse. So find a verse that speaks to you and memorize it. Put a little post-it note, put it on your desk, put it on the dashboard of your car. Wherever you find that you feel anxious, put that verse there and memorize it so that when anxiety or fear or whatever is trying to take over your control panel, you can be like, hold up. And you repeat it, and it reminds you that you serve a God who can come in and into that situation. It stops that spiral of emotions. Studies show that gratitude and anxiety cannot coexist in your brain at the same time, which I think is an interesting study. that someone did. I don't know how they figured that out. But so another way to combat when you're feeling anxious is to start remembering, writing down all the things you're grateful for. Because gratitude and anxiety can't be in control of the control panel at the same time. So that's a practical tip that we can all use. This one is more for kids. Create a positive association. I think about kids going back to school. We've got some kids who get really anxious about going back to school. So one thing that kids can do if they're feeling anxious about going back to school is take them to school before school starts. Take them to school and then read a book they love right there on the school property. Play tag. Do something that they think is fun. Bring water guns and squirt each other with water guns. Something that lodges in them that school is fun, school is safe, school is a place that I like. So if you have a situation that every time it's every time you go to your mother-in-law's for dinner, you're find a way to go to your mother-in-law's and create a positive association with that space. Because otherwise, the second you walk in, you're gonna be we've done this even with dogs. Right? My mom's dog does not like to have his nails cut, and he gets real anxious if he walks in the vet. So the vet's bring him in just periodically, and we'll just pet him and not do anything bad to him. So he learns to love the vet's office. It's that same concept. So if you have a space that makes you anxious, try to go to that space and create some positive vibes there so that because otherwise you're going to walk in, the second you walk in, you're going to start girding yourself for this bad thing to happen. This is another one for kids, the noodle pose. The noodle pose is just so sitting or laying just like a noodle. And they say if you do that for 2 to 3 minutes, which seems like a long time to me, to really sit there and do nothing for 2 to 3 minutes to me would feel like an eternity. But that calms your body. So if anxiety is taking over the control center, what happens is rest and relaxation will kind of take over that control center. And then anxiety gets kind of pushed off to the side. So having that noodle pose. And finally, if these things aren't enough, you get help. Get help from the Lord, and then also get help from a trained professional. And don't wait. In our culture, we are told, most of us in this room or my generation or above, and we were told, suck it up, buttercup. Deal with it. Don't talk about your emotions. Don't ask for help. Figure it out. We were told not to talk about our emotions. When I asked my mom about going to getting help, she's like, I'm not going there. I'm not going to get counseling. They'll dig into my past and make me hate my parents. She has this idea that counseling's going to dig up all this terrible stuff in her background and going to convince her that she's crazy or convince her their parents are bad parents or something. I'm like, no, Mom, that's not their job. Their job is to listen to what's going on. And so don't be afraid if anxiety is ruling your control center on the regular, don't be afraid to get some help because they can help you learn to get anxiety off of that control center. They can help you with tips like this and other ones, help you get to a place where you can be ruled by the emotion you want to be ruled by. I want to be ruled by joy. That's the emotion I want in control of my control center. I don't want anxiety and stress and fear to be running my control panel. And so if the emotion that you want is not ruling your control panel, start going to the Lord. Sit at his feet. Let faith conquer your fear. Let faith conquer your anger. Let faith conquer your worry. Let faith conquer your anxiety. God can do all things, including change your heart and the way you react to things. But you got to ask him in. You have to invite him in. He doesn't barge in. You've got to sit at his feet and let all the stuff not get done, and that's okay. So if you would like to get closer to the Lord, if you would like to have better control over your emotions, if you want to deepen your faith, and like I said, faith is over here and fear is over here. If you want to be moving this way, closer to the faith end of the spectrum, I dare you to do at least one of these 4 activities this week. The more of these you do, the more you're going to move to that end of the spectrum. So the first one is think about or journal about things that make you or your child feel anxious. For me, it's a cramped calendar. For me, it's when I look at my calendar and I see I have 2 or 3 things every day, and I'm like, how am I ever going to have time to breathe this week? That's my trigger, and I know it. My problem is I don't recognize it ahead of time. Sometimes I recognize it when I'm like, ah. What is it with you that triggers anxiety taking over your control center? And then I want you to start imagining those situations and imagining yourself handing them over to God. Imagine yourself trying one of the tactics that I gave you today. Sit at Jesus' feet instead of worrying about all the things that can go wrong. You can ask God to show you situations where anxiety gets the better of you. You might not even recognize it. It's taken me a long time to recognize that trigger, but my calendar is a trigger. Now that I know it, it's helpful. And I am more able to ask him into that ahead of time. Not always, but I'm better able to ask him into that ahead of time. But ask the Lord to show you how he wants you to handle those situations. Ask the Lord what situations you two need to talk about. Read and I would say memorize, not just read. I would say read and memorize Philippians 4. It says, be anxious for nothing, or do not be anxious, whichever version you're looking at. But in everything, by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God, and the peace of God, bring that, peace of God that surpasses understanding, it doesn't make any good sense, will guard your hearts and minds. And then the final one is to engage. Who in your life is being conquered by fear and anxiety, aside from yourself? Who else in your life is being conquered by fear and anxiety? Pay attention to what is triggering them. Maybe have a conversation with them about, hey, I've noticed that when this happens, you have this reaction. And maybe share some of the tips we learned today. Help them, help your kids, help your family members see that when you are being ruled by anxiety, we can move away from that through faith. Share Philippians 4 put Philippians 4 on your desk. And so that when people see it, they're like, oh, I want that. Whatever. So how can you help others who aren't here right now benefit from what you've heard, learned, felt today? Because faith conquers fear. And when we sit at the feet of Jesus, we kick anxiety off our control panel and we replace it with love and joy instead. And all of God's children said, amen.